You just stole something you don't understand, Amara Johnson said, her voice calm but cutting clean through the low hum of laughter that filled the grand hall, and for a brief second, the room hesitated, not because they believed her, but because of the way she said it, like she knew something they didn't, like she was standing on ground none of them could see. The chandeliers above shimmered against polished marble floors, casting reflections of wealth, power, and people who had never once questioned their place in the world, and right in the middle of it all stood Amara, her dark skin catching the light in a way that made her impossible to ignore, even as they tried. Her canvas bag worn at the seams hung from her shoulder, the only thing about her that seemed out of place in a room where watches cost more than houses and voices carried the weight of old money. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the security guard said, softer now, almost uneasy but still firm, and behind him, a man in a navy tuxedo smirked, swirling his drink as if this was just another form of entertainment. "Come on, let's not make this awkward," he added, loud enough for others to hear. "This isn't exactly your scene." A few guests chuckled, their eyes glancing at one another, silently agreeing, the kind of agreement that didn't need words. Amara didn't move, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag, her posture straight, her chin level, not defiant, not aggressive, just unshaken. "I was invited," she said, her tone steady, and that only made the laughter ripple louder, sharper this time. "Invited?" the woman in diamonds repeated, raising an eyebrow. "By who?" she asked, tilting her head as if already certain no answer would satisfy her. Amara reached into her bag slowly, carefully, pulling out a folded envelope, its edges slightly creased but handled with care. "By the Foundation," she said, holding it out, but the man beside her stepped forward before the guard could react, snatching the envelope with a careless flick of his wrist. "Let's take a look at this invitation," he said mockingly, unfolding it halfway before pausing, his expression shifting just enough to be noticed, but instead of reading it, he laughed it off louder than before. "You know what this looks like?" he said, holding it up for others to see without actually showing anything. "It looks like someone trying very hard to pretend they belong." More laughter, louder now, filling every corner of the room. Amara's eyes didn't follow the envelope, they stayed on him, steady, unwavering. "You don't get to decide that," she said quietly. And that was when he dropped the envelope and reached for her bag, curiosity now turning into something more careless, more reckless. "Then let's see what you actually brought," he said, pulling it open before she could stop him. Inside was nothing glamorous, no jewels, no designer labels, just a single folded piece of paper, aged, delicate. He pulled it out between two fingers like it might crumble. "This?" he scoffed, unfolding it slightly. "This is what got you in here?" The crowd leaned closer, unimpressed, dismissive, until Amara took one step forward, her voice still calm but now carrying something heavier, something that made the air shift. "Be careful," she said. "That's not just paper." He rolled his eyes, shaking his head as if she was still playing some game he couldn't understand. "Relax," he said. "If it's so important, maybe you should have kept it somewhere safer." And just as he turned slightly, ready to hand it off or toss it aside, a voice from above cut through the room, low, controlled, impossible to ignore. "He's right about one thing," the voice said, and every head turned as William Carter stepped into view at the top of the staircase, his presence alone enough to silence the laughter. "You should be careful," he added, descending slowly, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the paper in the man's hand. "Because if you damage that," he said, each word measured, "you'll be responsible for something far more valuable than anything else in this room." The man blinked, caught off guard, the confidence slipping from his face. "It's just a drawing," he muttered, but William didn't look at him, not yet. His gaze shifted to Amara, studying her, recognizing something, a detail, a memory, something that didn't belong to coincidence. And in that silence, in that moment where the room held its breath without realizing it, the balance of power began to tilt, just slightly, just enough that no one could stop what was coming next. The man's fingers tightened around the fragile paper, but now his confidence was no longer loud, no longer careless. It had thinned into something uncertain as William Carter reached the final step and extended his hand, not forceful, not rushed, just steady. "May I?" he said, and it was not a question anyone in that room would dare refuse. The man hesitated for half a breath before placing the paper into William's hand, and the moment it left his fingers, the room seemed to shift again. Quieter now, heavier. William unfolded it slowly, carefully, like someone who understood the weight of what he was holding, his eyes scanning every line, every detail, And then something changed in his expression, not shock, not disbelief but recognition, the kind that settles deep before it ever reaches the surface. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice lower now, directed only at Amara, but everyone leaned in anyway, trying to catch what did not belong to them. Amara did not move. Closer, she did not rush to explain, she simply met his gaze. "I did not get it," she said. "I made it." A ripple moved through the crowd, softer this time, not laughter, not yet disbelief, but something in between, something fragile. The woman in diamonds scoffed lightly, trying to recover the tone of control she had before. "That is impossible," she said, folding her arms. "That design was commissioned years ago." William did not look at her. His attention remained fixed on Amara, studying her face as if searching for something beyond her words. "It was never completed," he said slowly, almost to himself. "The original architect disappeared before delivering the final concept." Amara nodded once, a small movement but deliberate. "Because they stopped listening," she replied, her voice steady. "They wanted something safe, something predictable. Not something that would actually change the communities they were building in." The silence that followed was different now. No longer dismissive, no longer comfortable. It pressed in from all sides. William's grip on the paper tightened just slightly before he relaxed it again, smoothing it gently, respecting it. "This concept," he said, turning the paper slightly so the light caught the fine pencil lines. "This is not just a design, this is a framework for integrating housing, education, and local business in a way that has never been approved before." He paused, finally lifting his eyes to the others. "And it solves the exact problem our foundation has been struggling with for the last 3 years. The man who had mocked her shifted his weight, his voice now quieter, uncertain. "So what? She copied it," he said, but even he did not sound convinced. Amara's gaze flicked to him for the first time, not angry, not defensive, just clear. "If I copied it," she said, "why does it include revisions that were never made public?" William's eyes narrowed slightly, and without another word, he reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, scrolling quickly before turning the screen toward the nearest table. "The internal draft from 18 months ago," he said. "Confidential, never released?" He glanced back at Amara. "And yet your version reflects changes we only discussed in private meetings." The room froze again, but this time there was no laughter left to fill it, only the quiet realization that something had been misunderstood in a way that could not be undone. The woman in diamonds took a step back, her voice softer now, almost cautious. "Then who are you?" she asked, and for the first time Amara shifted her weight, her hand brushing lightly against the strap of her worn bag, grounding herself in something familiar. "I am the one they erased," she said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a truth that landed heavier than anything else that had been said that night. William exhaled slowly, the pieces settling into place in his mind, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not just authority but respect. "No," he said quietly. "You are the one they underestimated." And somewhere in that room behind the silence, the first crack in their certainty began to spread. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, stretched, tightened like a wire pulled too far. And then the murmurs began again, softer this time, uncertain, no longer fueled by confidence but by doubt. Eyes that once dismissed Amara now searched her, measuring, recalculating, trying to understand how someone they had already judged could suddenly stand at the center of something they could not control. William Carter turned the paper once more in his hands, slower now, as if every line carried a story he had missed before. "This was not just rejected," he said quietly, almost as if correcting his own past assumptions. "This was buried." His words did not echo loudly, but they traveled, carried by the weight of realization rather than volume. The man in the navy tuxedo let out a short laugh, forced, thin. "Come on, buried, really? You are making this sound like some kind of conspiracy," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it once had. William finally looked at him, not with anger, not even with irritation, but with something far more unsettling, calm clarity. "Do you know how many proposals our foundation reviews in a year?" he asked. The man hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "Hundreds," William continued. "And do you know how many of those ever reach a boardroom discussion?" he added, pausing just long enough for the silence to answer for him. "Very few." He shifted his gaze back to Amara. "And the ones that challenge existing systems," he said. "The ones that require people in power to give up control," his voice lowered slightly. "Those rarely make it past the first review." The woman in diamonds stepped forward again, but this time her tone had changed, less sharp, more careful. If that is true, she said, then why was this never brought forward again? Amara's eyes flickered briefly to the paper in William's hands before returning to the woman. Because I was told it was not the right fit, she said, her voice even controlled. And, when I asked why, they stopped responding. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, the kind that carried recognition, not of her, but of a system they all understood in ways they rarely admitted. The man who had taken her bag shifted again, his posture no longer relaxed. So you are saying someone just ignored a project worth billions? He said, trying to regain ground. Amara shook her head slightly. No, she replied. I am saying they ignored the person who made it. The words landed heavier than anything before, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. William inhaled slowly, his mind moving through pieces that had never connected until now. Meetings, reports, decisions made quickly. And without question, names he had never seen, voices he had never heard. And now one of them stood in front of him, steady, unshaken, despite everything that had just happened. What happened after they rejected it? He asked, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in Amara's expression, not weakness, not hesitation, but something quieter, something deeper. I kept building it, she said. On my own. A few people exchanged glances, confused, skeptical. But William did not look away. How? He asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. Amara lifted her chin slightly. Piece by piece, she said. Community by community, I tested parts of the model where I could, small spaces, local partnerships, places no one here would ever visit. Her voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now, something earned, and it worked. William's grip on the paper tightened again, just enough to show that the weight of her words had reached him. You are telling me, he said slowly, that while we were debating theory in boardrooms, you were already proving it in the real world. Amara did not smile, did not nod, she simply held his gaze, and that was answer enough. The room felt different now, not just quiet but aware that something had been overlooked in a way that could not be undone. The man in the tuxedo opened his mouth again, searching for something to say, something to restore the balance he had lost, but nothing came, because for the first time that night, the truth did not need to be defended. It was already standing there, undeniable, and William Carter, a man who had built his empire on recognizing value before others did, realized in that moment that the greatest mistake was not in the design that had been buried, but in the person they had all failed to see. The weight of her words did not fade, it settled deeper into the room, pressing against polished glass and quiet wealth until even the smallest movements felt louder than they should. Someone set down a glass too quickly and the sound echoed, sharp, out of place, and no one laughed this time. No one dared. William Carter stood still for a moment longer, the paper in his hand no longer just a document but something closer to a mirror reflecting every decision that had been made without question. Every voice that had been filtered out before it could be heard. Who reviewed your submission? He asked finally, his tone calm but carrying an edge that had not been there before, the kind of edge that did not need to be raised to be felt. Amara did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting past him for a fraction of a second, scanning the room, not nervously, not searching for approval, but as if confirming something she already knew. Names change, she said quietly. Titles change. Departments change, but the pattern does not. A few people shifted where they stood, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to reveal that her words had found their mark. William's gaze sharpened slightly. That is not an answer, he said, and for the first time there was a trace of pressure behind his voice, not directed at her, but at the truth itself. Amara met his eyes again, steady as before. It is the only one that matters, she replied, and the simplicity of it left no room for deflection. The woman in diamonds inhaled slowly, her posture no longer as rigid. If what you are saying is true, she began, choosing each word carefully now, then this is not just about one rejected proposal. She paused, glancing briefly at William. This is about how decisions are being made. William did not respond right away, but the silence that followed was different now, no longer uncertain but deliberate, controlled, as if something larger was forming beneath the surface. The man in the navy tuxedo cleared his throat, trying once more to regain footing. Or, he said, forcing a small smile, it is about someone trying to turn a mistake into an opportunity. His eyes flicked toward Amara. You show up here unannounced with a story that conveniently fits a narrative and suddenly we are supposed to believe that you were overlooked. He shrugged lightly. That is a bold claim. The room held its breath again, waiting, watching. Amara did not react the way they expected. There was no anger, no rush to defend herself. Instead, she reached slowly into her bag. Once more, her movements calm, deliberate, and pulled out a second folded sheet, thinner, more worn. She stepped forward just enough to place it on the nearest table beneath the chandelier light. Then do not believe me, she said. Look at the data. William moved first, crossing the space between them without hesitation, unfolding the paper carefully, his eyes scanning faster this time, sharper, and then stopping. His expression tightening just slightly. These are field results, he said. Almost to himself, pilot tests. Amara nodded once. 6 locations, she said. 3 states over 18 months. She tapped lightly on one section. Cost reduction in housing development by 22%, local business retention increased by 31%, and school enrollment rates up by 14%. Her voice remained steady, factual, leaving no room for exaggeration. The numbers hung in the air. Undeniable, measurable, real. William looked up at her, and there was no doubt left in his eyes now, only recognition and something heavier, responsibility. You built all of this without funding from the foundation? He asked, and this time the question carried something more than curiosity. Amara exhaled softly, not tired, not defeated, just honest. I built it because no one else would, she said. The room shifted again, not with noise but with awareness, the kind that could not be undone once it settled in. The man in the tuxedo did not speak again. The woman in diamonds looked down at the paper instead of at Amara, and William Carter stood there between 2 versions of reality, the one he had believed in, and the one now unfolding in front of him. And for the first time that night, it became clear that what had been taken from Amara was not just opportunity, it was recognition. And what she had brought back into that room was something far more powerful than proof. It was truth that could not be ignored any longer. The numbers did not fade from the room, they lingered, pressing into every polished surface, every carefully constructed identity, until even the air felt heavier, more honest than anyone had planned for that night. William Carter remained still, the 2 sheets of paper now side by side in his hands, theory and proof, concept and reality, and for the first time in years, the distance between those 2 things felt unacceptable. Who funded the pilot locations? He asked, his voice quieter now, but sharper, not directed at the room, only at Amara, because she was the only one who could answer. Amara shook her head slightly. No one you would know, she said. Local owners, small investors, people who believed in something they could actually see working. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, not accusing, not bitter, just clear. People who did not need a boardroom to decide what mattered. A subtle shift passed through the guests. A few looked away, others adjusted their posture. The kind of quiet discomfort that does not announce itself but cannot be hidden. The woman in diamonds exhaled slowly, her confidence no longer intact. And you did all of this, she said carefully, without recognition. Amara's expression did not change. Recognition does not build anything, she replied. Work does. William's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in realization, because he knew that answer too well. Just from a different side of the world. The man in the navy tuxedo stepped forward again, but this time his voice carried something different, not mockery, not dominance, but a thin edge of defense. Even if that is true, he said, gesturing toward the papers, that still does not explain why none of this came through official channels. He paused, searching for control. Systems exist for a reason. Amara turned her head slightly toward him, her gaze steady. Yes, she said. They do. She took a small step forward, not aggressive but intentional. They exist to protect what is already comfortable. The words landed clean, undeniable, and the man did not respond, because there was nothing left to say that would not sound hollow. William inhaled slowly, his eyes moving once more across the data, across the design, across the person standing in front of him who had carried both without anyone noticing. How many times did you try to bring this back? He asked. And this time the question was not about information, it was about something deeper, something personal. Amara paused for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer but because she did. 3, she said. The first time they told me it was too ambitious, the second time they said it did not align with current priorities, and the third time, she let out a soft breath, not tired, just matter of fact, they stopped responding completely. A silence followed that felt heavier than before because now it carried something else, accountability. The woman in diamonds lowered her gaze to the table. The man in the tuxedo looked toward the exit as if considering leaving, but did not move, and William Carter stood at the center of it all, holding the evidence of a failure that had not just cost an idea but a person. "You came here tonight," he said slowly, lifting his eyes back to Amara, knowing how this room would react. It was not a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "Because this is where the decision was made to ignore it." Her eyes met his fully now. "And I wanted to see if anyone here would recognize it when it was right in front of them." The words settled into him deeper than anything else that had been said, because they were not just about the past, they were about this moment, this exact room, this exact choice. William looked around, then really looked at the people who had laughed, who had dismissed, who had chosen comfort over curiosity without even realizing it. And for a brief second, the power dynamic that had defined the room all night shifted again. But this time it did not tilt, it broke. "Then let us make sure," he said, quietly but with a clarity that carried through every corner of the hall, "that it is not ignored again." And the moment those words left his mouth, the night stopped being about doubt or proof or even the past, and became something else entirely, something none of them had prepared for. The beginning of a correction that would force every person in that room to confront not just what they had missed, but why they had missed it in the first place. The shift did not happen loudly. It moved through the room like a current beneath still water, invisible at first but impossible to ignore once it touched you. And for the first time that night, no one reached for a glass, no one checked a phone, no one looked away, because what stood in front of them was no longer a disruption. It was a decision. William Carter stepped closer to the table, placing both sheets of paper flat beneath the chandelier light as if anchoring them in place. "We are going to verify every part of this," he said, not as a suggestion, not as an option, but as a fact, and the authority in his voice did not rise. It settled, firm and undeniable. The woman in diamond straightened slightly, instinctively aligning herself with the shift in power. "Of course," she said, her tone measured now, careful. "That would be the responsible next step." But even as she spoke, her eyes remained on the data, no longer dismissing it, no longer questioning whether it mattered, only realizing that it did. The man in the navy tuxedo stayed silent, his earlier confidence now reduced to stillness, his gaze fixed somewhere between the table and the floor, as if calculating the distance between what he had assumed and what was now undeniable. Amara stood where she had been, not moving closer, not stepping back, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already crossed the threshold everyone else was just beginning to see. William turned to her again, and this time there was no distance in his tone, no hierarchy, only focus. "Do you have documentation for the pilot locations?" he asked, and the question carried weight, not doubt but expectation. Amara nodded once, reaching into her bag again, the worn fabric shifting softly as she pulled out a small stack of folders, edges slightly frayed but organized with precision. She placed them on the table beside the papers. "Every site," she said. "Financial breakdowns, community reports, long-term projections." She paused briefly, her fingers resting lightly on the top folder. "Nothing hidden." William did not hesitate, opening the first folder, scanning quickly, his eyes moving faster now, absorbing, connecting, confirming. The room leaned in again, but this time not out of curiosity, out of necessity, because what was unfolding was no longer a story, it was evidence, real, structured, undeniable. "These numbers align," William said after a moment, more to himself than to anyone else. "The margins, the growth patterns, the scalability." He exhaled slowly, then looked up. "This is not theoretical." The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything before, because it removed the last layer of doubt anyone could hold on to. The woman in diamond stepped closer to the table, her voice quieter now, almost respectful. "How did you manage the funding gaps?" she asked, and the question carried something new, not skepticism, but genuine inquiry. Amara's expression softened just slightly, not in emotion but in clarity. "I adjusted the model," she said. "Scaled down where necessary, partnered locally instead of relying on centralized funding." She tapped lightly on one of the reports. "It was not perfect, but it worked." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any complex explanation could have, because it revealed something none of them had accounted for: adaptability without approval. The man in the tuxedo shifted again, finally speaking, though his voice was lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Even if this is valid," he said, "it still needs formal review, board approval, compliance checks." He listed the steps as if rebuilding the system around himself, trying to regain structure. William turned his head slightly toward him, not dismissing but not agreeing either. "Yes," he said, "it does." He paused, then added, but not in the way it was handled before. His gaze returned to Amara, steady, direct. This time it starts with the person who built it. The words shifted something deeper than authority, they redefined it. The room felt it, even if no one spoke it aloud, and for the first time since she walked through those doors, Amara allowed herself the smallest shift in posture. Not relief, not victory, but recognition, not given but earned, and as William Carter closed the folder gently, placing it beside the original design, it became clear that what had been taken from her was not just opportunity but voice, and what was happening now was not just acknowledgement, it was the beginning of giving that voice back in a way no one in that room had ever expected. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not, because once something true is seen, it cannot be unseen. And now every person standing there was no longer reacting to a disruption. They were standing inside a realization. William Carter remained beside the table, one hand resting lightly near the documents as if anchoring the moment in place, his mind moving faster than his body, connecting what he had just seen with everything that had come before it, meetings, reports, recommendations that had seemed complete at the time but now felt incomplete, filtered, shaped by voices that never had to question their own assumptions. He exhaled slowly, then turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room, not searching but measuring. Who handled the initial review cycle for community integration proposals? He asked, his tone calm but precise, and the question landed with a different kind of weight, because this time it was not directed at Amara. It was directed at them, the system, the people who had been part of the process without ever being questioned. A few glances were exchanged, subtle, quick, the kind that tried to avoid attention but only drew more of it. The woman in diamonds hesitated before speaking. The review committee rotates, she said carefully. It is not a single person. William nodded slightly, but his eyes did not soften. Then the process failed, he said, not loudly, not accusingly, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. The man in the navy tuxedo straightened just enough to speak again, though his voice carried less certainty than before. With respect, William, he said, every proposal is evaluated based on established criteria. If hers did not move forward, there must have been a reason. The room held still, waiting, and William did not respond immediately. Instead, he picked up one of the reports again, scanning a section before looking back up. There was a reason, he said, his voice steady. It just was not the right one. The words settled differently than anything else that night. Because they did not reject the system, they exposed it. Amara remained where she stood, her presence unchanged. But now there was something else in the way she held herself, not pride, not relief, but a quiet steadiness that came from no longer needing to prove anything, because the proof was already there, undeniable. The woman in diamonds stepped closer again, her attention now fully on the documents. If this is validated, she said, her voice thoughtful, it could shift how we approach every project moving forward. She paused, glancing at Amara. It could change the model entirely. William's gaze moved briefly to her, then back to the table. It already has, he said quietly, the statement simple but final. The man in the tuxedo exhaled through his nose, a small gesture of tension. You are making a decision based on one case, he said. That is not how organizations operate. William turned to him fully now, not sharply but completely, giving him his full attention for the first time. No, he replied. I am correcting a decision that should have never been made. The difference between the two statements was not subtle, it was absolute, and the man fell silent, because there was nothing left to argue that would not sound like resistance to something already proven. William shifted his focus back to Amara, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something new, something that had not been present when she first walked into the room, respect that did not need to be stated, only recognized. What do you need to scale this? He asked, direct, clear, and the question itself changed everything because it no longer positioned her as someone asking for approval, but as someone defining what came next. Amara did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, over the documents, the design, the evidence of everything she had already built, and then back to him. Access, she said simply, to the same resources that were never offered before. Her voice remained steady, not demanding, not hesitant, just clear. And the ability to implement without being filtered out. The room absorbed her words, and for the first time, no one tried to interrupt, no one tried to redirect, because the structure they had relied on all night had already shifted beyond repair. William nodded once, a small movement but decisive. Then that is where we begin, he said, and as the words settled into the space between them, it became clear that this was no longer about recognition alone, it was about restoration, not just of an idea, but of the path that had been taken from her. And in that moment, every person in that room understood, whether they admitted it or not, that the balance of power had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not tonight, not after this. The words settled, and with them came a silence that did not feel empty but decisive, like the moment just before something irreversible begins. William Carter did not move away from the table, his posture steady, his presence no longer just commanding but anchored in something deeper, accountability, and for the first time that night, the room was not waiting for permission to react, it was waiting for direction, the kind that could not be undone once spoken, effective immediately. "William," said, his voice calm but carrying across every inch of the hall, "this project is being reinstated under direct executive review." A quiet intake of breath moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, because they all understood what that meant. It bypassed layers, processes, filters, the very structure that had allowed this to be ignored in the first place. The woman in diamond straightened, her composure returning, but reshaped now, aligned with the shift rather than resisting it. "That will require board notification," she said, careful, measured, but not opposing. William nodded slightly. "It will be handled," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no opening for delay. The man in the navy tuxedo finally looked up fully, his expression no longer defensive but strained, as if trying to hold on to a version of control that had already slipped away. "You are setting a precedent," he said. His voice quieter now, almost warning. "Others will expect the same." William's gaze moved to him, steady, unwavering. "Then they should bring the same level of proof," he answered, and the simplicity of it ended the argument before it could begin, because no one in that room could deny what had been placed in front of them. Amara remained still, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held her shoulders now, not heavier, not lighter, just different, as if something that had been carried alone for too long had finally been seen by others, not taken from her, but recognized, and that distinction mattered. William turned back to her, the noise of the room fading into something distant, irrelevant compared to the clarity of what stood between them. "I want a full presentation within 48 hours, he said, direct, precise. "Not to prove this works," he added, glancing briefly at the documents, "but to show how fast we can implement it at scale." The request did not feel like a test, it felt like an opening, one that had been closed before she ever had the chance to step through it. Amara met his gaze, her expression steady, grounded. "You will have it," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no need to consider whether she was ready, because she had already been doing the work long before this moment existed. The woman in diamonds stepped closer, her tone now carrying something new, professional respect. "If you are presenting to the board," she said, "you will need support, logistics, access to internal data." She paused briefly, then added, "I can assist with that." The offer hung in the air, not as charity, not as correction, but as alignment, and Amara nodded once, acknowledging it without overextending the moment. The man in the tuxedo remained where he was, silent now, his earlier voice replaced by something quieter, less certain, because the structure he had relied on had already shifted beyond his control. William glanced once more at the documents on the table, then at the room around him, the people who had witnessed the shift, and the ones who would carry its consequences beyond this night. "We are done here," he said finally, not dismissive, not abrupt, just clear. And as those words settled, the tension that had filled the room did not release, it transformed into something heavier, more lasting, awareness, and as people began to move, slowly at first, conversations low and measured, glances exchanged with new understanding, Amara reached for her bag, lifting it back onto her shoulder with the same quiet care she had carried it in with. But this time, the weight was different, not because it had changed, but because the room around her finally had. And as she turned toward the exit, not hurried, not lingering, just moving forward, it became clear that what had started as a moment of confrontation had become something far greater. A shift that would not end when the doors closed behind her, but would follow every person who had stood there, into every decision they made next. The doors had barely closed behind Amara when the room exhaled, but it was not relief, it was something closer to exposure, as if the polished walls and perfect lighting could no longer hide what had just been revealed. Conversations began in low, controlled tones, no longer filled with laughter but with careful words, chosen with more intention than before. William Carter did not leave, He remained where he stood, watching the shift unfold, not with satisfaction but with focus because he knew this moment was not finished, it had only changed form. The woman in diamonds stepped closer to him, her voice lowered now, professional, precise. "You understand this will reach the board before morning," she said. William nodded slightly. "It should," he replied, his gaze still on the table where the documents had been laid out, as if the evidence itself had not yet finished speaking. Across the room, the man in the navy tuxedo stood near a column, his posture composed but his expression tight, his earlier confidence replaced by calculation, and then slowly, he stepped forward again, not toward Amara this time but toward William. "There is something you should consider," he said, his tone measured, careful not to sound confrontational. William turned his head slightly, giving him just enough attention to continue. "If this becomes public," the man continued, "it does not just reflect on the process, it reflects on leadership." He paused, letting the implication settle. "On you." The words hung there, quiet but deliberate, the kind meant to redirect responsibility without appearing to do so. William studied him for a moment, not reacting immediately, not dismissing, but understanding exactly what was being said. "Leadership is not about avoiding mistakes," William said finally, his voice calm, steady. "It is about correcting them when they are found." The response did not rise, it did not push. But it closed the space the man had tried to create, leaving no room for deflection. The man nodded slowly, though his eyes did not fully agree, and he stepped back, blending once more into the room that no longer felt as secure as it had before. Near the exit, Amara paused for a brief second, not turning back fully, but just enough to glance over her shoulder, her eyes moving across the space one last time, taking in what had shifted, what had been revealed, and what still remained unresolved. Because she understood something the others were only beginning to realize, this was not just about being seen, it was about what happened after. Outside, the night air was cool, steady, a sharp contrast to the tension she had just stepped out of. She adjusted the strap of her bag slightly as she moved down the steps, her pace unhurried, grounded, as if she had always known this moment would come, even if she did not know when. Back inside, William reached for the documents again, gathering them carefully, not as objects but as responsibility, and as he did, one of his assistants approached quietly, holding a tablet. "Sir," she said, "there is already internal traffic, the review committee has been flagged and someone is requesting to lock access to prior submissions." William's eyes narrowed slightly, not in surprise but in recognition. "Of course they are," he said, his voice low, controlled, because this was the part no one else in the room had yet seen. The part that did not happen under chandeliers or in front of an audience, but behind closed systems, quiet decisions and sudden resistance. "Do not allow it," he added, his tone firm. "Full transparency, effective immediately." The assistant nodded quickly, stepping back to carry out the instruction. The woman in diamonds glanced toward him, her expression thoughtful. "You expect pushback," she said. William did not look at her, his attention already moving ahead, beyond the room, beyond the moment. "I expect patterns," he replied, and that difference mattered because patterns did not stop on their own, they had to be broken. And as the room slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming with a different tone, a different awareness, it became clear that what had been uncovered was not just a single oversight. It was something deeper, something embedded. And as Amara disappeared into the night, carrying nothing more than she had brought in, the real shift began somewhere else entirely. In the systems that had once ignored her, now scrambling to respond to a truth they could no longer contain. The city outside had not changed, but something inside it had, even if no one on the street could see it yet. And as Amara walked down the wide stone steps into the cool night air, the noise of distant traffic and soft conversations from nearby restaurants felt almost unreal compared to the silence she had just left behind. She did not rush, she did not look back again, because she understood something most people in that room did not. The moment itself was never the victory, what came after was. And inside the building that after had already begun, William Carter stood in his office now, the glow of multiple screens reflecting across the glass walls, the documents from earlier spread across his desk, no longer part of a conversation, but part of an investigation. His assistant stood across from him, tablet in hand, her voice steady but quick. "Access logs show unusual activity within the last 20 minutes, she said. "Several files related to past proposal reviews have been flagged, and some have already been archived." William's expression did not change, but his focus sharpened. "Archive does not mean deleted," he said, more as a statement than a question. No, sir, she replied, but access is being restricted. He nodded once, processing, connecting, understanding the pattern. Unfolding exactly as he expected. Pull everything before it disappears, he said, his tone controlled, precise. Every submission, every review note, every internal comment tied to those decisions. The assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but because she understood the scale of what he was asking. That could expose internal disagreements, she said carefully. William looked up at her then, his gaze steady. It should, he replied, and the clarity in his voice left no room for hesitation. She nodded and stepped out quickly, already moving to execute the order across town. Amara stepped into a small workspace tucked between two older brick buildings. The lights inside warm but simple, a desk, a few shelves, papers neatly stacked, sketches pinned to the wall, not for display, but for progress. She set her bag down gently, the same care she had shown all night, and for the first time since she walked into that hall, she allowed herself a moment to pause, not to celebrate, not to reflect, but to prepare, because she knew what 48 hours meant. It was not just a presentation, it was a test of whether the system could truly change or if it would reshape itself just enough to appear different while staying the same. She reached for a notebook, flipping it open to pages filled with notes, diagrams, timelines, everything she had built piece by piece without recognition, and now, for the first time, it would be seen at the level it was always meant for. Back in the office, William's screen filled with lines of data, timestamps, internal communications, the quiet history of decisions made behind closed doors. And as he scrolled, a pattern began to form, names appearing more than once, comments repeating the same language, the same reasoning, dressed differently but carrying the same intent, not aligned with current priorities, too complex for initial rollout, lacks scalability without significant restructuring. Phrases that sounded logical, reasonable, but now, placed side by side with the results Amara had already proven, revealed something else entirely, not evaluation but avoidance. His assistant returned, her expression more focused now. We recovered partial archives, she said, placing the tablet on the desk. But some files were already moved to restricted access. William's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration but in confirmation. Then we are not the only ones looking, he said, his voice low, thoughtful, because this was the moment where resistance moved from passive to active, the kind that did not happen in front of a crowd, but in quiet attempts to reshape the narrative before it could be fully exposed. He leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the data. Notify legal, he added, and lock external communications on this until we complete the review. The assistant nodded again, already moving, and as the room around him filled with the quiet urgency of action, it became clear that what had started as a single confrontation had now become something far more complex, a process that would not only restore what had been taken from Amara, but would force every layer of the system to reveal itself in ways it had never been designed to do. And somewhere between those two worlds, one preparing to present the truth, the other trying to control it, the next 48 hours began to take shape as something neither side could fully predict, but both would have to face. Morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale wash of light across glass buildings and quiet streets. But inside William Carter's office, nothing about the day felt ordinary. Screens were already alive with movement, updates stacking faster than they could be read, and the quiet tension from the night before had evolved into something sharper, more focused. His assistant stood near the desk, her voice steady but urgent. We traced the restricted files, she said. They were not just archived, they were flagged for internal review by a subcommittee that does not officially exist on the organizational chart. William's eyes lifted slightly, not surprised, but confirming what he had already suspected. Names, he said simply. She tapped the screen and a list appeared. A pattern of repeated involvement across multiple proposals, different departments, different titles, but the same individuals appearing again and again at key decision points. They call it a compliance buffer, she added. It filters high-risk proposals before they reach senior leadership. William leaned back slightly, his gaze narrowing. High risk, he repeated quietly, then looked back at the data, or high impact. The distinction settled between them, and neither needed to say more. Across the city, Amara sat at her desk, the early light casting long shadows across pages filled with sketches, notes and timelines, her laptop open. Files organized with precision, she moved through them with calm efficiency, selecting, refining, structuring, not creating something new, but revealing what had already been built. Each section of her presentation layered with intention, design, data, outcomes, and most importantly, The people behind those numbers, communities that had already begun to change in ways no boardroom had predicted. She paused briefly, her fingers resting on the edge of the keyboard, then opened a new section, titled simply Implementation, because she understood that was where the real resistance would appear, not in what had been done, but in what came next. Back in the office, William stood now, looking out across the city, the reflection of the screens behind him faint in the glass. His assistant approached again, tablet in hand. Legal has reviewed the situation, she said. If the internal process intentionally suppressed viable proposals, there could be significant implications. William did not turn immediately, his voice calm, measured. There should be, he replied, because for him this was no longer about risk, it was about responsibility. She continued. There is also external interest building, she added. A few inquiries have come in regarding unusual activity in the Foundation's review system. William turned then, his expression composed but focused. No statements yet, he said. We move after the presentation. The assistant nodded, understanding the strategy, not to react, but to act with clarity once everything was fully revealed. Hours passed not in noise but in movement, quiet decisions, controlled actions, information being secured before it could be reshaped. And across town, Amara's workspace transformed from preparation to precision, slides aligned, data verified, narrative sharpened into something that could not be dismissed or diluted. She reviewed each section not for approval, but for truth, because she knew that once she stepped into that room again, it would not be about proving herself, it would be about forcing the system to confront what it had chosen to ignore. As the clock moved closer to the deadline, the distance between the two worlds began to narrow, one built on structure, the other on substance, and somewhere between them, the moment that would connect both was approaching. Back in the office, William returned to his desk, the name still displayed on the screen, the pattern now undeniable, and as he studied it one more time, he understood that this was not just about correcting a past decision, it was about dismantling the mechanism that allowed that decision to happen in the first place. His assistant looked at him, waiting. Prepare the full board session, he said finally, his voice steady, final. No filters, no summaries, full access to everything. She nodded, already turning to act, and as the day moved forward, both sides prepared in their own way, one ready to present the truth, the other ready to face it, and neither could fully predict how the next moment would unfold, only that it would change everything that came after. The boardroom did not feel like the hall from 2 nights before. There were no chandeliers casting warm light, no quiet laughter filling empty space, only a long table of glass and steel, screens lining the walls, and a silence that carried weight instead of comfort. Every seat was filled, not just with people, but with expectation. William Carter stood at the head of the table, not speaking yet, allowing the room to settle into the moment they all knew was coming. Across from him, members of the board reviewed the documents that had been sent ahead of time, pages turning slower than usual, not because they lacked understanding, but because they could feel what those pages represented, a shift that could not be contained within procedure. The doors opened quietly, and Amara Johnson stepped in, not rushed, not hesitant, her presence calm, grounded, carrying none of the tension that filled the room because she had already lived through it. She placed her materials on the table with the same care she had shown before, precise, deliberate, then lifted her eyes, meeting the room without seeking permission. William nodded once, a small signal, and stepped aside, not leading, not framing, simply making space, and that act alone changed the structure of the room. Because it made clear where the focus belonged. Amara began without introduction, her voice steady, clear, not raised, but carrying through the silence with ease. This is not a new idea, she said, the opening line landing without decoration, without hesitation. It is a completed system that has already been tested, measured, and refined in real environments. She moved through her presentation with precision, each section building on the last, not overwhelming, not rushing, but aligning data with outcomes, outcomes with people, and people with purpose. The screens behind her shifted from design to results, from projections to lived impact. Housing stabilized in communities previously overlooked, small businesses sustained beyond their first year, schools reporting consistent enrollment increases, numbers that were not theoretical but proven. One board member leaned forward, studying the screen more closely. These results, he said, they were achieved without foundation oversight. Amara nodded. Yes, she replied, because oversight was never offered. The response did not carry accusation, it carried clarity, and that made it harder to dismiss. Another member spoke, her tone measured, analytical. Your model requires decentralization of control, she said. That presents risk. Amara did not move from her position. It presents accountability, she answered. Risk exists when decisions are made without proximity to the people they affect. The room absorbed that, not rejecting it but recalibrating around it. William remained silent, watching, not intervening, because he understood that this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to the truth being presented. As Amara moved into implementation, the room shifted again, not with resistance but with recognition. Timelines laid out clearly, phases defined, resource allocation mapped with efficiency that reflected years of work done without support, and yet built to scale once that support was finally present. A different voice entered the conversation, quieter but firm. Why was this not brought forward earlier? The question lingered, not directed at Amara but at the system itself, and for a moment no one answered, because the answer had already been shown, not through words but through absence, through omission, through decisions made in rooms that looked very much like this one. Amara closed that gap with a single sentence. It was, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with the understanding that what they were witnessing was not discovery, but correction. William stepped forward. Then, not to take over but to anchor the moment. This is the full record, he said, gesturing to the screens. Every submission, every review, every outcome. His voice steady, controlled. And every point where this system chose not to see what was in front of it. The words settled into the room, not as accusation but as fact, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance of power shifted completely, not toward one person but toward truth itself. And as Amara stood there, not asking, not proving, but simply presenting what had always been there, it became clear that this was no longer about whether her work would be accepted. It was about whether the system could accept what it had been missing all along. The silence that followed did not ask for a decision, it demanded one, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one reached for language to soften it. No one tried to reframe what had already been made clear. The evidence was not waiting to be interpreted. It had already spoken, and now the room had to respond. One of the senior board members leaned back slowly, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on the screen as if searching for something that could still justify what they had allowed to happen, but there was nothing left to find, only what had been missed. We cannot proceed as if this is a standard approval, he said finally, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. This requires a structural response. Another member nodded, not in agreement alone but in recognition. The review system itself has to change, she added, her tone firm, no longer cautious, because caution had already proven insufficient. William Carter did not interrupt. He did not guide, he allowed the conversation to move where it needed to go. Because this was the part that could not be directed. It had to be realized. Amara stood at the front of the room, still, composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, not holding anything now, because everything she needed had already been placed in front of them, and for the first time she was not being measured, she was being heard. The same board member spoke again, this time turning slightly toward her. If we move forward with this, he said, it will not just be your model we adopt, it will be your framework for how decisions are made. He paused, letting the implication settle fully. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The question did not challenge her ability, it acknowledged it, and that difference changed everything. Amara met his gaze without hesitation. I have been carrying that responsibility, she said, her voice calm, grounded, just without the authority to act on it. The room absorbed her answer, not as defiance but as truth, and in that moment, the final barrier between recognition and action dissolved. William stepped forward then, not to take control but to close the distance between what had been revealed and what would happen next. Then we formalize it, he said, his voice steady, clear. Effective immediately, this project moves into full-scale implementation under a new directive. He paused, his gaze moving across the board, ensuring there was no misunderstanding. Led by the person who built it. The words settled with a finality that did not need to be reinforced, because no one in the room had anything left to oppose it. With the woman in diamonds now seated among the board, nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of a shift she could no longer deny. We will need to restructure oversight, she said, already moving into action, and reassign the review authority. William inclined his head slightly. It is already in motion, he replied, and that statement carried more than preparation, it carried inevitability. Across the table, The man who had once stood in the hall with confidence now remained silent, his presence reduced not by force, but by the weight of what had been exposed, and in that silence, the system that had once protected him no longer held the same power. The meeting did not end with applause. It did not need to. It ended with alignment, decisions made not to preserve what was comfortable, but to correct what had been wrong. As the board members began to gather their materials, conversations shifting from doubt to implementation, Amara stepped back slightly, not retreating but allowing the space to move forward without her needing to hold it in place. William approached her then, his expression composed but no longer distant. "You brought it back," he said quietly, not referring only to the project, but to something larger, something that had been lost within the system itself. Amara's gaze remained steady. "It was always there," she replied, and that was the truth that lingered beyond everything else. Not that something new had been created, but that something real had finally been seen. As she gathered her bag once more, the same worn canvas that had carried everything from the beginning, it no longer looked out of place, not because it had changed, but because the room around it had learned to recognize its value. And as she walked toward the door, not hurried, not paused, just moving forward, it became clear that what had been taken from her was not just opportunity, it was acknowledgement, and what had been given back was not just success, it was something far more lasting, the right to define her own worth without needing permission from anyone else. And in the quiet that followed her exit, the system she had just reshaped began to move, not around her but because of her, in a way that would carry far beyond that room, into every decision that came after.